The cabin lights were soft and golden, the kind that made everything feel a little quieter, a little more forgiving. Margaret Ellis adjusted the cuff of her navy blazer as she settled into her first-class seat. At 62, she carried herself with a quiet confidence that came not from wealth, but from years of steady work, careful decisions, and the kind of resilience only time can teach. Her silver-streaked hair was neatly pinned back. Her eyes, gentle, observant, moved calmly around the cabin. Across the aisle sat a younger woman, perhaps in her early 30s. Her posture was upright, almost guarded. She wore a tailored black suit, crisp white blouse, and just enough makeup to suggest professionalism without vanity. Her name, as Margaret would soon learn, was Claire Donovan. Claire's expression held something familiar, not arrogance, not quite discomfort either. Something in between. The look of someone who had learned to expect resistance, and prepared herself for it. A flight attendant approached, tall, blonde, with a tight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Ma'am," she said to Claire, her voice polite but firm, "I'm afraid there's been a mix-up. This seat is reserved for first-class passengers." Claire blinked once, calmly. "It is my seat," she replied softly, handing over her boarding pass. The attendant glanced at it, then back at Claire, hesitation flickering for just a second, before her expression hardened. "I understand," she said, lowering her voice slightly, "but perhaps you'd be more comfortable in economy. We can sort this out after boarding." There was a pause. A quiet, heavy pause. Margaret felt it immediately, that shift in the air that older generations know too well. The kind that says something isn't right, even if no one says it aloud. Claire didn't raise her voice. "I'm exactly where I belong," she said, steady and composed. The attendant exhaled, clearly annoyed now. "Then I'm afraid you won't be receiving first-class service until this is clarified." And just like that, she moved on. No meal. No drink. No acknowledgement. Margaret watched Claire carefully. There was no anger on her face. No visible frustration. Just a slight tightening of her hands in her lap, and then stillness. The kind of stillness that takes practice. Margaret leaned slightly toward her. "Excuse me, dear," she said gently, her voice warm like an old quilt, "would you care to share my tea while they sort things out?" Claire turned, surprised. For a moment, the guarded look softened. "That's very kind of you," she said, offering a small smile, "but I'm all right." Margaret nodded, not pushing. "I've learned," she said quietly, "sometimes it's not about the tea." Claire let out a soft breath, almost a laugh. "No," she said, "it usually isn't." A few minutes passed. Passengers were being served meals now, neatly plated dishes, the quiet clink of silverware, the low murmur of polite conversation. But Claire sat without anything in front of her. Margaret noticed the man seated a few rows back watching as well. Others, too. People always notice, even when they pretend not to. Margaret leaned closer again. "You remind me of my daughter," she said softly. Strong, but tired of having to prove it. Claire looked at her this time, really looked. "My mother used to say something like that," she replied. "She'd tell me, 'Don't fight every battle out loud. Some are won just by standing your ground.'" Margaret smiled. "She sounds like a wise woman." She was, Claire said, her voice quieter now. There was another pause. Then Claire reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. Not hurriedly. Not dramatically. Just calmly. She typed a short message, then set the phone down again. Margaret didn't ask. Time passed slowly after that. 5 minutes, perhaps. Maybe less. Then something shifted. A man in his late 50s, dressed simply but sharply, walked briskly into the cabin. His presence wasn't loud, but it carried weight. The kind of presence people instinctively make space for. He spoke briefly with the same flight attendant. Margaret couldn't hear the words, but she saw the color drain from the woman's face. The man turned toward Claire. And then, something unexpected. He smiled. "Miss Donovan," he said warmly, "I'm terribly sorry for the misunderstanding." The entire cabin seemed to pause. Claire stood slowly. "It's all right," she said. "No," the man replied gently, "it isn't." He turned to the crew, his voice still calm, but unmistakably firm. "We don't measure people by appearance here. Or assumptions. We measure by respect." The words weren't loud. But they carried. Margaret felt a quiet warmth settle in her chest. Not because someone was being corrected, but because someone was being seen. The man gestured toward the empty space beside Claire. "May I sit for a moment?" Claire nodded. They spoke softly for a minute or two. Nothing dramatic. No raised voices. No scene. Just a conversation. When he stood again, he turned once more to the crew. "Kindness isn't a policy," he said. "It's a habit. And habits matter." Then he walked away. The flight attendant returned shortly after, her posture different now. Softer. More human. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly to Claire. Claire met her eyes. "Thank you," she replied simply. No bitterness. No triumph. Just acceptance. A meal was placed before her soon after. Warm. Carefully arranged. But it wasn't the meal that mattered. Margaret reached over gently and touched Claire's hand. "You handled that beautifully," she said. Claire smiled faintly. "I used to think strength meant pushing back," she said. "Now I think, sometimes it just means not letting the moment change who you are." Margaret nodded slowly. "That's something it takes a long time to learn." They sat together in comfortable silence after that. Two women from different generations, connected not by circumstance, but by understanding. As the plane moved steadily through the evening sky, the cabin seemed softer somehow. Calmer. People returned to their meals. Their conversations. But something quiet had shifted. A reminder, perhaps. That dignity doesn't shout. That kindness doesn't need an audience. And that sometimes, the most powerful thing a person can do is simply remain gentle in a world that isn't always gentle back. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, listening to the steady hum of the engines. It reminded her of long drives from years ago, of simpler times, of lessons learned slowly. When she opened them again, Claire was looking out the window, her expression peaceful now. Not because everything had been perfect, but because she had stayed true to herself. And in the end, that was more than enough.